Hola, hola. Esto es Agrimundo TV Podcast con Will Caban.
Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to be back again. We have our episode 2003 with our dear friend John D. McCown, and he's a legend, and we're lucky and privileged to have him with us. Rather than do the traditional interview about the current situation where John is contacted by CNN and all BBC, everybody around the world, I want to make today's interview personal. Personal for me and personal for John. We'll get to hear his journey, which I think is really incredible because I like to say in life, they're intersections. And John's life is full of intersections. He grew up in Mobile. And on my side of things, when I hear Mobile, I think of Jimmy Buffett. And I think of the songs that we grew up with. And there's a saying, live your life like a Jimmy Buffett song. And I've driven across the nation many times in my life. And when I take I-10, I drop down underneath the bay through the George Wallace Bridge. And there's Mobile, and that bay's so beautiful. And then I know when I'm eastbound, I'm on the last stretch going through Florida. So that's my connection with Mobile. But in doing research for this interview, I found out that John, Malcom McLean, and John's father all have an intersection. And John's going to tell us all about that, and I'll be asking him questions as we go through his life. But the Waterman Steamship Corporation plays a great role in all three personalities' lives. John, welcome to the podcast.
Will, very pleased to be here, and thank you for that kind introduction. As you were talking about it, I was smiling because I too am a fan of Jimmy Buffett, and Jimmy Buffett actually went to my high school about 5 years ahead of me. He's kind of the ballads of the Gulf Shores, and Jimmy Buffett is one of my favorites.
Wonderful, wonderful. When I was doing the research, the Waterman Steamship Corporation came up, and correct me if I'm wrong, but your dad was in the Navy, and then he worked with Waterman there in Mobile. And as a child, I'm sure he took you down by the docks, or the life was, part of your DNA. And years later, after going to LSU, and you go up to New York to work in banking, nothing related. And most people hear the general story and they don't understand this wonderful backstory. And then you're up in New York and you're in banking and you're at Harvard and you read about the Malcom McLean story. And then that takes us back. Where were you when Malcom bought Waterman Steamship? And tell us a little bit about the backstory there.
Well, yeah, there's a wonderful intersection, and Mobile is where my interest in shipping started. My dad, for a few years, was a salesperson at Waterman, and then went on to a real estate career. But so I was born in Mobile, and I was born around the same time that Malcom bought Mobile's big shipping company, Waterman Steamship, and used part of it to build what would become Sealand. And I do remember my first experience in seeing shipping was my dad taking me down to the docks, and then race forward. My dad was in the Navy and was kind of an active Navy League member. And one Sunday afternoon, my dad signed us up for going out on kind of a day cruise on the Lexington, the aircraft carrier that was in and out of Pensacola, where they trained naval pilots on how to land. And so that was a fascinating day and kind of my first real exposure to something as big as a ocean-going ship. And that really kind of was a catalyst for what would become my later interest in shipping. And you're right, I started out of college, came to New York and went to work for a bank, and I didn't necessarily think I'd spend my career in banking, but I also knew that it'd be great experience, whatever I ended up doing. And then I went back to business school and was fortunate enough to go to one of the top business schools. And that's where it really kind of the intersection began, because I was in one of my classes in my first year at business school. One of our professors came in holding up a cover article of a Business Week magazine, and he held it up and he said, at this school, we hope to teach you how to be risk-taking entrepreneurs. And this is a great article. I encourage everybody to read it. And it was a cover article on Malcom at the time, and this is when he had kind of come out of semi-retirement, if you will, and bought U.S. Lines. And so I read that, and many of our classmates read it, and I was fascinated and realized there was a connection in terms of Mobile, and through people that I knew in Mobile who knew somebody, I arranged a meeting with Malcom McLean, and I guess he was kind of interested. The shipping industry wasn't a big recruiter of Harvard Business School students, but I met. And that was kind of the beginning, and I kind of put on hold plans to go into investment banking. I'd had a job offer to work the summer between years at business school, and I pursued a job at U.S. Lines. And when I was there, I realized that Malcom McLean worked with a small group in a New York office, and I pursued a job there, and then ended up spending my career, and so 20 years really on a daily basis working with Malcom.
Wonderful. Now, tell me a little bit about U.S. Lines. Did they also own the USS United States?
By the time when Malcom bought U.S. Lines, they had moved away from the passenger business, and the big U, as they called it, I think it had been laid up, 25 years earlier.
Right.
And so U.S. Lines then was a purely container operator. Also had a number of break bulk vessels that were kind of chartered to the military, but it was obviously all U.S. flag, but it was very small relative to the first company that Malcom founded, Sealand. But what Malcom proceeded to do was to bring in new assets, most particularly what he called the econ ships, which were at the time the largest container ships in the world by about 30%, and designed to be the biggest ships that could go through the Panama Canal. And with that, and with some other assets, significantly increased the size of U.S. Lines. For a brief period, actually, U.S. Lines was the largest container shipping company in the world.
Wow. Now, Malcom started out like a lot of the giants of the sea. They worked with surplus ships, right? And they retrofitted them and created a fleet the way Onassis did, and the other Greeks. I remember I was looking up, there were 9 Titans that you listed in your book, Giants of the Sea. And I know that after World War II, there was so much surplus equipment that people started fortunes with that. Was that Malcolm's model?
Less than, for instance, the Greeks and others. You're right. There were thousands of surplus ships that the U.S. had built, the Liberty ships and the Victory ships, and they kind of became the merchant fleet of the world. The U.S. sold them in favorable terms to all of their allies, and Waterman had, in effect, managed some of those ships. So the Waterman fleet included those, but it was kind of the in-place Waterman fleet. Malcom bought Waterman and used part of it to start what then was kind of the new container shipping, with the first sailing April 26, 1956. And it was and at the time, Malcom was had McLean Trucking was one of the largest trucking companies in the country, so he had in-place demand and had a significant amount of freight moving from Texas and Florida to New York. And so, not surprisingly, the first service, and for the first several years, container shipping was purely a domestic service, moving freight from one part of the U.S. to the other. And so that first sailing from the New York area to Houston was that. And of course, Malcolm had studied what he thought the cost would be, and his numbers were right on the mark. And it was significantly lower cost to move the same amount of freight that way than to move it by truck. And Malcolm had researched this, and one of his, this is before really the interstate system, and so on a lot of his long hauls, congestion on the highways was becoming more of a problem. You didn't have the interstates that we have now,
Right.
And so he saw it as a smart way of doing things, and that goes back. Malcolm's story of his first insight was as a truck driver in the early days of McLean Trucking, where he was dropping off a load of cotton in Hoboken, New Jersey. And he ended up waiting for about 6 or 8 hours for the stevedores to unload it. And that gave him a chance to really watch what was going on. Malcolm had many talents and skills, but he was perhaps one of the most keen observers of anything freight. When he started as a truck driver, wherever he would go, whatever freight he was moving, he'd ask questions to the people. He'd want to know where it was going, and he'd see kind of the various differences. And so on that day in Hoboken, as he's watching the manhandling large bales of cotton off and putting them in cargo nets and hoisting them up and kind of stowing it, he found himself thinking, well, wouldn't it be nice if you could just move the entire body of the van? And that, of course, was a thought that he kind of tucked away. And when he was looking at different ways of lowering the cost, that became kind of the genesis of container shipping. One of the interesting observations that I came across when I was doing further research in my book, and I said in my book, if one had to, the initial sailing of a vessel called the Ideal X on April 26th, that was a fairly big deal. The governor of New Jersey came by because people were aware of this, and of course Malcolm was a very successful trucking company, so people knew this was a very serious proposition. But even then, people didn't realize what would become of that. And I've made the statement, and I believe it. If one were to historians, I think, in years in the future, if they kind of peg when did this concept of globalization, which I would go on and on about how beneficial globalization has been to the world, certainly to the U.S. Some people now misrepresent it, but if you had to pick a day for when globalization started, I would say it was the sailing of the Ideal X on April 26th. The other interesting kind of coincidence, another indication of what would come, in April of 1956, that was also the month the very first fully assembled new Toyota, was shipped from Japan to the U.S. And of course, we know what would happen in terms of that. There was another interesting story. Malcolm was not big in terms of nautical memorabilia, and kind of Malcolm basically saw his mission in life was to move freight from one point to another at a lower cost. And so he wanted to rename the vessel that he had converted, and he came up with a name. He called it the Ideal X. And as he would explain to me years later when we were working closely, ideal was fairly clear. He thought that he called it that because he thought that was the ideal way of moving cargo from Houston to New York, was by water. But he appended X to it because around that time in the mid-50s, when the Air Force was was testing an experimental plane. They'd call it, they'd put an X in front of it, the X-15, meaning it was experimental. And so Malcom put that, but after the sailing and after Malcom had looked at all the numbers, he took the X off because it was no longer an experiment. He had kind of proved it. So that's kind of the very beginning. Again, Race Ford, when I was with him, what I called in my book the econ ships, I refer to as the second container revolution. And by that, what I mean was what Malcom was able to do then with the econ ships was to take the very clear and known process advantages of containerization, the process of putting things in a metal box and keeping them in that box and all the efficiencies within that, and then he augmented that with the scale economics of massive ships. When he built the econ ships and the econ ships themselves were successful for a whole lot of other reasons, and I'm not going to get bogged down in the weeds, but having little to do with Malcom, U.S. Lines ended up not being a success. A lot of it had to do with the additional vessels that were purchased, but and there was much criticism within the industry that those ships were just too big. Again, they were 30% larger than any ship afloat at the time, about 4,400 TU. But today, the largest ships in the world are pushing 25,000 TU. So they're literally 6 times larger. And it was really Malcolm's initial, with the econ ships that made people start to see the superior economics of those vessels. And of course, those vessels, they're now probably more than 2,000 vessels in the world, the size or bigger than the econ ships. So I think it's appropriate to call what he did with the econ ships the second container revolution, which in many ways is powerful an impact is the very invention of container shipping.
John, I've got a question I was thinking about today. You're a man of numbers and you were doing all your charts and everything. Were you ever able to quantify how much you were able to multiply the efficiency of switching to the sea containers? In other words, was it 4? Was it 10 times? Was it 20 times? The
way I look at that, yeah, I think it was definitely a double-digit multiple. But what I've always found is a useful way of looking at it, and I even had in my book, I had a chapter kind of reviewing this and kind of the differences on this one measure. I think a very useful way of thinking of shipping is what is the cost of transport relative to the value of the goods you're moving. And when you go before during World War II and right after World War II, there was really no specialization to speak of, in shipping. It was starting to have some specialization with tankers, but you, for the most part, most cargo moved on what was called general cargo ships. And so those were, it would move, chemicals would move in barrels and things would move in bags, and you had tween decks and, a very laborious way of loading. And shipping was also much kind of related to things you couldn't get wherever you were. So it was kind of coffee beans from Brazil and marble from Italy, and there wasn't the concept of taking something that was made somewhere and then making it cheaper the other place didn't really exist because of that friction, what I call the friction of transport cost. And around one, also the ships were extraordinarily small. A typical cargo ship in World War II, the Liberty vessels, were 450 feet long. So relative to today's ships, they really didn't move the needle in terms of total cargo. And back then, it wasn't unusual. The cost of shipping something was a significant double-digit percentage of the value of those goods. It wouldn't be unusual that to move something, the shipping cost would be 50% or 60% more of the value of those goods. Race forward to today, and we have a clear benchmark on what that cost is, and how that friction has been reduced. And prior to let's talk about 2019, prior to the pandemic, because rates spiked up about 3 times in terms of overall pricing. But in 2019, if you were to take the total number of containers that moved in the world, and it would have been something in the order of 155 million TEUs, and used a credible figure in terms of the average value per TEU, and there was a group of academics that came up with a very detailed study that arrived at about 54,000 per TEU as kind of an average value. If you were to take that and multiply it by the number of containers, and you have a giant figure in terms of the hundreds of billions of dollars worth of stuff, and then you were to compare that to the total revenue of the container shipping industry, and the total revenue, and there's a profit on top of that, so the total revenue is more than cost, what you arrive at is a ratio of a little more than 2%. And so what used to be, a very big number, call it, 30, 40, 50% or more of the value of goods, is raced down to be, on average, as little as 2%. Now, that's going to vary, of course, by goods, and this is container shipping. You have some different metrics in bulk shipping and tanker shipping, but that's just an amazing, when you start to think about that, all of a sudden that friction, that barrier to entry of distance has virtually disappeared. And so once you know that, you start to understand when during the pandemic, if you look at the aggregate overall pricing, went up by a factor of 3, went back down mostly, and is starting to kind of bounce more now. But even when it went up by a factor of 3, you're still talking about 6 or 7% of the value of the goods, and that's the simple reason you didn't see much of a reduction. In fact, we all know during the pandemic, worldwide volume actually spiked, particularly to the U.S., because even though no shipper wants to pay any more than they have to, and they'll scream about any increase, but something that is still only 6% of the value of the cargo isn't going to be a deal breaker. And so that is the extraordinary value that I think containerization has brought to the world. I happen to think that it has given consumers more choice. It has increased competition, made people more efficient. I know there are a lot of people that will disagree with that. They'll come up with all sorts of rigmarole in terms of what is unfair and what isn't. But I reject that. It's to me it is incontrovertible that trade has collective benefits to the countries that are involved in it. To the extent that people have a problem, an issue, the issues come up in terms of how those benefits are allocated. And there I turn around and point to the policymakers who could have done a better job of making sure what, again, is clear collective benefits. And so obviously it goes without saying, I think that these tariffs and the current view on tariffs is just nonsensical. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question. But container shipping has grammatically and geometrically and kind of exponentially reduced the cost of shipping to the benefit of everybody. To the benefit of everybody.
So on the subject, because today we're going to talk about the origin of containers and the origin of shipping, because it plays a big role, as you mentioned, the transfer of goods around the world. And I'm going to take you back 5,000 years, maybe a little bit more, to the first nautical beings. Are you familiar with the Austronesians?
The Phoenicians.
Well, the Phoenicians in one side, but the Austronesians were coming around. And the interesting point is the Austronesians were based out of Taiwan. And
fascinating.
Yeah, and the Phoenicians had a contribution on the container side, and I sent you a picture of it, a little video that I made of, they used a clay, almost like a, I don't know how you describe it, they call it an amphora. And
Yes.
they would stuff it with olive oil or with wine or with dried fish. And the Phoenicians that had their big route in the Mediterranean, the Austronesians were actually out in the Pacific and came into Southeast Asia, but they didn't have anything to carry. They were in a double hull canoe almost, and in looking at the different technologies that went along from 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, as we got closer, to the 14th, 15th century, the technology was nothing more than the shape of the sails. And
yes,
you got more efficiencies, and people followed certain routes. And the India trade in the dhows that came up, this is the 700s through the 13th, 14th century, was the triangle of the sail, and then they depended on currents and wind, and that's how they got around. And once they had to wait for the monsoon season to get them from one point to the other. Before that, the Arab traders really had to hug the coast, come down into Africa. But
well, you're so right, and it's fascinating. And some of the further research I did for my book, I have a whole chapter on kind of the early history of cargo shipping. And what's always been amazing to me is how similar it was, literally for thousands of years, in terms of moving something from one point to another. And you hit the nail on the head also with the amphorae. I'm mispronouncing it, but
yes.
they were kind of designed in all sorts of sizes. They had handles that allowed them to be tied up. They'd be kind of stuck together.
Interlocking. There was exactly. The concept. The concept was there in a very rudimentary form.
Right.
They designed things so that they would fit and maximize the space on the vessel.
And one group and there were a whole series of people that became massive creators in their own networks. You had the Venetians. Before that, you had the Romans. The Romans were major users of the amphorae. Just like the old song, all roads lead to Rome. 2,000 years ago, all ships headed to Rome. And
right.
When I was in Italy a couple of years ago, I did a little research and was delighted to find that right next to the giant modern airport, the Da Vinci Airport outside of Rome, is the ruins of the old what was called Portus, and one of the Roman emperors built they called it Portus, and I think that became the derivation for even our term port. But they built a canal to have these sailing ships, and I think that in some years there were hundreds of sailing ships that would come into Rome. There was a giant grain trade, from Egypt to Rome, and they wanted to get it closer to central Rome, and so they built some pretty good size canals, and they built this canal that would go into a big open area, and it was kind of an inland harbor that they dug out that they called Portus. And in fact, when the rental car I was at, it had a GPS, and I was able to see where the old Portus is. It's now kind of filled in and grown in and private, so I couldn't actually see it. But the research that I did on it for a couple of hundred years, it was where all the cargo came into Rome. And in fact, they had a couple of large, not mountains, but hills, on the perimeter of it. And
Famous seven hills of Rome, huh?
Well, not that, but they had some hills that were literally created. The amphorae they would use over and over again, but there were some that were broken. And there was this one area where they kept on putting them, and so it's like 300 feet high because of undoubtedly the millions of amphorae. And then you have the Vikings. The Vikings, everybody hears about the Viking, their pillaging, and I guess there was a lot of raping and pillaging by the Vikings. But it's also a massive trading network, for 300 years. So, and all of these groups were doing things that were, not too different, from century to century.